With Istio, you can apply authorization policies that are enforced by the target service. So you define authorization policies, and the control plane is going to configure the proxy in each pod to enforce them. But that means that if you have hundreds of services, you need to define hundreds of authorization policies, which can be quite complicated and error prone. In Gloo Platform, we have this concept of a workspace that we use as a natural boundary around sets of namespaces so that we can tell the platform that you want zero trust to be applied in the bookinfo workspace, and then automatically the platform generates the corresponding Istio authorization policies so that only the services that are part of this workspace and the ones that are exported can communicate with one another. So let's take a look. So first, if I try right now to access from a pod that is not in the mesh, so one that's called not in mesh, and if I try to access the review service that is in the bookinfo workspace, right now it's going to work because I didn't define any security policies to prevent that. So if so we can see a 200 response code. And obviously that's the same if I try to access from a service that is in the mesh, but not in the workspace. I can also access the review service because by default, any service can communicate with any other service, even if they're not in the mesh or in the mesh. If they're in the mesh, they get mutual TLS, but they can still communicate. If they're not in the mesh, you don't get mutual TLS, but you can still also communicate. And that's because we don't have any peer authentication objects. And the peer authentication, you can look to see how it works in this doc, but then there's multiple modes, and by default, it's permissive. But you can also make it strict mode by setting a peer authentication policies in the Istio system namespace, and then in which case only mutual TLS traffic is allowed. But again, the problem is the same. You'd have to create, unless you want to have globally accepted peer authentication rule, you're going to have to create multiple rules to have granular control over your applications. You'll have to do this in different places. So that's another thing that we simplify with Gloo Platform. So let's have a look and let's see it in action. So we're going to update my workspace settings for the bookinfo workspace. So we're importing services already from the gateway services, and we export to gateway. But here I'm going to enable service isolation and trim proxy config. And I'm going to show you what the second action does in a minute. So let's create this. And automatically we'll see that a lot of Istio authorization policies have been created automatically by the platform. And you can see the 4 services that are in this workspace. And you can see the product page has been exported to the gateway workspace. So all the identities, the spiffy ID, the one that contains the cluster, the namespace, the service account name, and all. So all the service accounts in my workspace, in the bookinfo workspace, and all the service accounts of all the namespaces of my gateway workspace, I can access the product page service. But if I look at the ratings, for example, I can see that it's only the service account of my bookinfo services because I didn't export that one. So that's good. That means that now we have all the security policies in place by just changing a single parameter in my workspace settings. But like we said, if you're in permissive mode, someone who's not in the mesh could still access the services. And that's why what Gloo Platform will do is we'll create these peer authentication policies automatically. So in a granular fashion, by service, we can define that we want to have a strict MTLS. So it's not going to impact any other services in the other workspaces. So you can decide one by one which workspace is ready to apply zero trust. Any workspace can do it now and they don't have to wait for the other workspaces. And the last thing we'll do is an optimization, the trim proxy config, which Gloo will create sidecar objects. And what sidecar objects do is it allows the control plane, Istio to know that it should configure every sidecar in a way that every sidecar is only aware of what other services that it's allowed to talk to. So it's an optimization. So for example, if I have 1,000 services in my cluster, instead of every sidecar proxy to be able to talk to all like other 999 other services, the sidecar resource will make it smarter so that it only knows about what other services it's allowed to talk to. So it's less memory, less resources, and so on. So automatically Gloo does all of this for you. And now we can validate that. So now if we try to access the review service from a service that is not in the mesh, it's going to be rejected. But because MTLS is mandatory, we have strict enabled, and it cannot establish MTLS connection to this other son. And then for the other one, the one that's in the mesh, but it's not in a service that's allowed to talk to reviews because it's not part of any workspace. So it cannot talk to that. As you can see that we're getting an explicit 403, access denied. So this is saying that I'm not allowed to talk to this service because there's no authorization policies. So it's very easy to set up zero trust posture using this workspace abstraction. But you can also decide that you want even more fine grain. Maybe you don't want all services in the workspace to be able to communicate with one another. So for example, you can configure it in a way that I don't want all these services to be able to talk to any others because ratings should not be accessed by the product page service directly. So in that case, you can create access policies. And here we can say, I only want gateways to be able to access the product page service. And then I can create another access policy where I can say, I only want the product page service to be able to access the details and reviews. And finally, we'll create another one where we can say product page reviews, only reviews to be able to access ratings. So you can validate that these services are supposed to have access to the other ones, can have access and so on. So for example, we'll just run these multiple commands to show product page to delete to details is allowed, and reviews to product page to review should be allowed, and product page to ratings should be denied. And if we look at the authorization policies, you can see that now you have more fine-grained policies in place. You can see reviews that can only be accessed by the product page service that can run on both cluster 1 and cluster 2. So it's not like any services in the workspace can talk to each other anymore by default. So you can really get control of and get a full zero trust posture at the workspace level without creating all these various rules. And if you wanted more fine-grained access, then you can accomplish that by creating explicit access policies.